what the practice of solidarity look like in our work, particularly thinking about this legal community.
Great. Thank you so much, Sonia. I just want to make sure y'all can hear me.
Yes.
Great. So thank you, Sonia. Thank you, John. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you to the Albany LGBT Committee and to all the co-sponsors. And a real special thanks to everyone who's joined us for taking time out of your evening to really wrestle with these difficult questions. So I get the gift and the burden of sort of starting us with the big container, and then we're going to spend the rest of the short time we have together, I think, really drilling down into some of these really hard and difficult conversations. So you asked, what does Asian Black solidarity mean? And I just want to first talk about what solidarity means to me, because I think solidarity to me is really an acting out of an understanding that, in this case, Black and Asian American history, current challenges and futures are completely interconnected and interdependent. And so it is a shift from an idea of acting in isolation, out of self-interest or out of small group interest, but really out of a broader understanding that compels a different form of action. And before I explore what Asian Black solidarity can look like, I think it's also important for us to define Asian American and think about how we define Asian American as a shared identity and as a space of expressed solidarity, or as a space of bar association creativity, right? The term Asian American, as many of you may already know, was actually coined by Asian American students in California in the 1960s who were directly inspired by the emerging Black Power movement of the time. In other words, our whole contemporary notion of a shared Asian American political identity, cultural identity, whatnot, and the ways in which we have built power from this shared identity was intended to be in solidarity with Black lives. And I think in the context of yesterday's Supreme Court win, and as Glenn mentioned in his introduction, it's particularly important for us as lawyers, we're guilty of this, to not think about solidarity as an expression or as an achievement of a series of rights. It is not, solidarity is not in form a menu of transactions. You get this, we get this, we got this, we'll give to you this. It's about transformation, and it's about moving away from seeing the person across from us in a purely transactional sense, in a way particularly moving away from thinking about us as sharing a pie, right? It is truly about acting as if we were recreating whatever the heck we want, whether it's a new pie or a 7-tier cake, or, you know, allow the metaphor to run on its own. And as to why this matters, I think it matters because it helps us turn the construct of what it means to defeat racism. And I'm sorry, it's the Mr. Softy truck running right past my window at this time. So I think it's human nature that we desperately want to think about racism as a series of individual and interpersonal experiences, largely because that's often how we have experienced racism ourselves as Asian Americans. Certainly for me, that was the case. And in that sense, I think as a series of interpersonal experiences, there's a path to address it. In other words, if I become less racist, if you become less racist, then there's less racism going around in the world, and we have therefore done our part. But that, of course, is not how racism works. And, you know, I really think it's important when we talk about solidarity that we move away from thinking about it as solidarity around racism. Racism is merely the primary mechanism by which the system of white supremacy is enforced. And white supremacy is the larger infrastructure. It is the economic, it is the cultural, it is the militaristic, and it is certainly the legal systems in which we operate each day. And as lawyers, I don't care whether we are officers of the court or corporate lawyers, civil legal services lawyers, nonprofit lawyers, justice lawyers, we enforce white supremacy every day in our offices and in our practices. We are, in fact, I would argue, the practitioners of the most formalized expression of white supremacy, culturally, at least in the United States. And particularly as lawyers of color and as Asian Americans, we have for far too long, I think, avoided confronting these very contradictions in our false, in some cases, but real, in many cases, proximities to white power, particularly through the expression of our professionalized identities. And one thing that I also think it's really important to note and to center in our analysis when we think about white supremacy is that it's a global system. And particularly right now, I think we are thinking about the emergence and calling for action around Black Lives Matters. We are thinking about the United States, but you know, when you work within activism, within systems of activism in history, we have to remember that these movements were interdependent, interlinked, and global. And for that reason as well, Asian Americans, we of all communities need to understand that white supremacy is practiced globally. Genocide, slavery, colonialism, and in contemporary times, as well as historic, white supremacy enforces the perpetual construct of wars and military interventions, right? Particularly in Asia, South Asia, the Middle East. That has been the principal way in which white supremacy has created the narrative of who is bad and who is good, who is outside and who is not, who is in. So that's like the larger, that's the bucket, bam, right? And what does that mean like for us? And what does that look like for those of us who are lawyers? I think it's a reckoning. I think this moment is a real moment for us to reckon with the tools that we've been given and the opportunities that we have with the access that we've created. And I think most importantly, silence and complicity are simply unacceptable, right? Silence and complicity are not harmless. If you have power and you choose not to shift it, then you are enacting violence, right? Whether you are in private or public or nonprofit practice, right? And I will be the first to tell you, not only have I witnessed this, I have participated in it, right? Who is chosen for what team? Who is trusted for which client? Whose story do we tell? Who do I risk any part of my professional life or personal life for? Is what is how I express my role within the white supremacy system. And for me personally, coming to understand my own embedded racism and actively naming it, and then coming into a practice of anti-racism, and in particular, anti-Black racism, thinking about how to counter anti-Black racism at every turn of my professional life has been the central part of my growth as a practitioner. And in many ways, I would say it liberated me as a lawyer. Some might say, for those of you who know me, it liberated me so much that I'm no longer practicing as a lawyer, but that's another Ebony panel we talk about. But I think it's important for us to come to a place of critical analysis. It was for me, so that such that instead of defensiveness, instead of analytics, instead of posturing like what's for me, what's for us, it really unleashed a sense of creativity and of collaboration, that there are solutions out there, unnamed, unseen, because I have been so willing to participate in a system that was predefined for me. And so, Sonia, you asked like, well, then what does it actually look like, right? And I've said like a whole bunch of fancy words and, you know, whatever feel good t-shirt, you know, Instagram phrases. But I do like to think that solidarity is an everyday practice. And I say this a lot. It's a community practice, and it's not something that we can really do effectively or successfully alone. So, you know, I thank and I deeply respect all of us on this call who have chosen to go on a march in your off hours from work. But I ask you, what have you actually done to put anything on the line? Like, what are you actually risking? And in particular, what power are you actually giving up in order to advance a different structure? And a core aspect of solidarity and expressing solidarity is the taking on of uncomfortable risks. Practicing it as an anti-racist and expressing solidarity is hard, it's necessary, and it is deeply uncomfortable, right? You will make mistakes and you will have to be accountable and transparent to owning those mistakes and moving on. And there's, you know, I would just say maybe in closing, like I think of 3 M's when I think broadly about solidarity. I think of mind, I think of money, and I think about mobilization, right? And in terms of mind, I would say, you know, you have to know your history. Like we have to know the history of the Asian American movement. We have to listen, right? And we have to learn to acknowledge racism and to practice anti-racism. Asian American lawyers in particular have proven that we are skilled at code switching. And I say we need to just break down, we need to take that skill, turn it on its head, switch the code again, and practice shifting power. Break down that code completely. Money, this is where the rub is. You know, I run a social justice fund, and I have to say, Moving your money is one of the biggest investments you can make towards becoming invested in social change. And move your money to Black-led organizing for systems change, right? How many of us think, oh, I'm doing my best, I'm expressing solidarity, I invest in Asian American communities. But part of solidarity and part of practice is to acknowledge that the people most proximate to injustice should be the ones who lead in developing and creating the strategies for whatever solutions that can be developed for all of our liberation. And when it comes to liberation, I think the third M, it's about mobilizing. You can do the work. You can read Ibram Kendi. You can read all the books you want. You can, push all the Facebook fundraisers you want. But solidarity is best practice when you mobilize to take action, and particularly when you mobilize to take action to change your own practices and to change the practices of others around you by example and by explicit conversation. Solidarity is an act of uncomfortable leadership. It is about moving beyond what is comfortable and breaking through whatever slightly porous membrane that's kind of held you back. It's about stepping into that next space. And we'll talk a lot tonight, I think, about like the different ways in which all of us have done that. And it's ugly and it's pretty and it's good, but I really welcome conversations, and I encourage our participants to post your thoughts in the chat for us. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jen, for sort of setting forward sort of frameworks for us to think through tonight. Joanne, I'm going to come to you next. You lead an organization dedicated to serving Asian communities, and your organization has also done a lot of great work promoting solidarity with Black communities and greater alignment, I guess, in our communities. Can you share a little bit more about the work that the Asian American Federation has done?
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really hard to say no to old friends. I've known Glenn for 50 gazillion years. And Sonia, you and I talk to each other all the time. And, Jen moderated panel for me. And I see Joanne, and I see other Olympia, and I see all the friends, the people I admire. And so it's really great to be here. And thank you for inviting me. And when we got to do a prep call, I had to joke that, it's the all J panel. It's like all of the speakers are J, and their dirty little secret is that I too have a law degree, but I've never practiced law because I was smart enough to get out and do nonprofit work. Jason Wu, the last time Jason and we were together, we were coming from Gracie Mansion, where Jason had his own encounter with like this crazy guy screaming at three Asians. This crazy white guy screaming at three Asians walking down the sidewalk because he felt like we took up too much sidewalk. And so Jason was, smart enough to pull out his cell phone, I remember, and, said, I'm going to make you famous. So, these are all of the encounters that we have. It's crazy. We are living through some really amazing times. And, it makes me really happy that we're starting to see change come to our front door. It also makes me really sad that I can't go out to protest because I have pre-existing health conditions, so I'm stuck at home. But the work that we've been doing has really been tackling all the social services work that has been defined by white supremacy. And so, there's a box this thing called the nonprofit world, and it's a box, and that box was not set out for people of color. And we've made, I wish I could say it like we did our best, and here are all the successes. But I think even nowadays, yesterday when we were talking about what happened with Supreme Court, these days, we are measuring success in teaspoons. And so I think part of the work that we do at the Federation, we are measuring our work in teaspoons as well, but I think there have been some significant things that we have accomplished. We have been one of the lead organizations for Communities of Color Nonprofit Stabilization Fund. It is a fund that we get from City Council, and it's to really build up the nonprofit capacities of all the nonprofits to serve the communities of color. We know that communities of color, the nonprofits in our communities need to be led by people who understand the culture, people who understand all of the practices, why all the uncles and aunties do the things that they do, but also the language expertise. And every year, you know, I think we probably did about over $10 million. I think we're going into our 5th year. And there were years that, you know, we got no money and we laughed and said, okay, we'll try again. It's with Hispanic Federation, it's with New York Urban League, the other Asian partner is CACF. And the thing that we promised ourselves was that we would never lose each other, and we would never capitalize off of somebody else's misery. And so when we did this work, there was we had so many questions because we had never done this before. And I'll tell you, the city bureaucracy, I'm sorry, Sonia, but city bureaucracy is a killer. And we would sit down with, like, you know, all of the city officials, and we would have 50 gazillion meetings because they wanted to know how to write this contract and what it should look like. And I had to ask all of my friends throughout the country, like, hey, you guys, have you ever seen this model? If you do, can you help us? And the response was, we've never seen this, but we would love for you to tell us how you did it because we want to do it in our city. And so, you know, it is going strong. It is now, I think more than ever, we are more committed. I think, you know, the conversations that I have with my counterparts, especially Hispanic Federation, with Urban League, I mean, like, we're on daily chats because we need to check in because there's so much happening and we want to be supportive. So that's a big accomplishment. For the Federation, we also have done so much work since January, actually, about all the anti-Asian racism, you know, due to COVID. You know, when our racist president calls it out and says it's Chinese virus, you know what's going to happen, and it's going to be Chinese people, Asians are going to get beat up. And so, you know, I've been pretty vocal. I've, you know, squared off against everybody. Like, you know, everybody, I know that I've heard that I have some people who hate me at City Hall, and I'm actually okay with that. But part of that also came with an opportunity for our own community to understand what that racism felt like, right? You're leading, you know, you're just going about your day, you're going to grocery shopping, you are minding your own business, and somebody comes and punches you out because you will, you know, they think you are, you know, Chinese, you know, that you're, you know, coronavirus carrier. And so we've experienced this recently. And so for us, you know, we've issued statements, and we started doing trainings with organizers of color because we wanted to make that conscious connection, that bystander training. How do we support each other during this time? About community building, you know, that was very critical for us to pick partners. You know, all the speakers had to be people of color because we wanted to make sure that it was, you know, in our platform, we had to present our colleagues, the people that we work with on a daily basis, to say, you know, this is our community. They're a part of our community. This is how we do community building. So, you know, that's been a work that we've been doing. Even the mental health sessions, you know, the very first thing we did after we did COVID lockdown was sitting with the nonprofit folks because they were seeing all kinds of crazy stuff in the front lines. And so the teachers that we picked and the instructors that we picked, the experts, have always been people of color because we wanted to make sure that we echo what our beliefs are. We are doing trainings around Black Asian community solidarity. What does that look like? So we have some experts lined up. I am hustling hard to get that money because I need to get everybody funded. You know, but we need to talk about how do we start to really build community for communities who have not traditionally gotten together or have had, you know, had problems before. And then besides that, many letters and many, you know, standing with solidarity, you know, standing in solidarity with the Black community. You know, I get to occupy a lot of different working groups, and you know, I think everybody thinks it's so great that, you know, somebody picks you from government to be on all of these committees. And it's kind of not awesome, to be honest, because it's like a huge time suck. But I think the thing that the Asian American Federation is really proud of is that every time we have been at those spaces, we've always said, how, you know, like, what are we centering here? Are we centering people who died during COVID? That's Black and Brown communities. What are the resources that they're going to need? How do we stand up for them? And when people have, like, spoken out of turn, you know, I put on my best Korean auntie hat to say, no, this is not about you. It's about the communities that have had historic underinvestments, that, you know, they have these like crazy, you know, death numbers. And, you know, like, let's in this moment where we're just seeing so much tragedy, let's just have like a, you know, come to Jesus moment of the fact that the Black and brown communities have always gotten under-resourced. And that's the Asian American community too. One of the things that we really want to be mindful of is that we are going to start to do some small business convenings. And this came out of, you know, serving on a committee that talks about small businesses. But, you know, even sitting in the mayor's small business, you know, advisory, the conversations that we had that was most powerful for me was around the challenge of the small business committee at a community and what they were not getting. And so the most vocal people have been, to be honest, it's been the Black, Latino, Asian leaders who are sitting in the committee to say, well, you know, if you are helping small businesses, what does it look like for us? Because all you're obsessed about is opening up sidewalk cafes, and we're trying to figure out, do you have anything translated for people who, all the small businesses who don't speak English, the fact that they didn't apply for any of those grants because they didn't know how, and the fact that some of the language access policy, even though we helped to pass the expansion of that law, is really, really shitty. And so, you know, it's calling out the obvious. And so in that moment, when we have these seats, we've been really making an effort to amplify each other. And I think sometimes if you sit in those committees, you think that, you know, we sort of plan these calls, but I think these are the natural moments of alignment where we can support each other and amplify each other. And then I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Thanks so much for sharing those examples with us of what solidarity can look like in kind of the local context. I'm going to switch tracks a little bit and come to you, Jin Hee, to talk a little bit about something that I know I've had conversations with friends and family about, and I think is something that, you know, I think concerns a lot of us about sort of anti-Black racism in our own communities, and, you know, how best to grapple with that. And so I was really struck by something you said in our prep call about anti-Black racism and sort of its role in perpetuating sort of Asian invisibility and some of the challenges we face as a community. So would love if you could speak a little bit more about that here.
Thank you so much. And I have to thanks to everyone who made this happen, because this is a subject that is very near and dear to my heart, and it's an important conversation. I hope it's, you know,
Oh, Jin Hee, sorry to interrupt you. I think your sound is going a little in and out.
Okay, how's this?
Better.
Okay. I was just thank everyone for putting this event together, because it's an issue that's so important to me. Especially because, you know, I have spent over a decade of 13 years at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and but I also feel very strongly about the discrimination within the Asian American community. And you know, one of the interesting things about my job right now is that I lead a lot of our criminal justice advocacy, and that I think it's, you know, it's very clear about the anti-Black racism within the criminal justice system, and I think that that's been abundantly clear in, you know, the nationwide protests and so forth. But I think that we should not limit the discussions about anti-Black racism in the context of the criminal justice system. And one thing that has really been somewhat a challenging experience for me personally, but also professionally, has been the education advocacy that I also lead at the Legal Defense Fund. And this is where I think, especially in situations where, and I appreciated what Jen said about this notion of having limited resources, and that people are kind of fighting for their piece of the pie, so it's kind of a zero-sum game. And that situation has really kind of unearthed a lot of underlying discrimination, even within the Asian American community, about Black people, about Latinx people. Two of the cases, or kind of advocacy that I'm involved in, is the affirmative action case at Harvard. We at the Legal Defense Fund represent 26 student alumni organizations that represent, it's very multiracial, all of the major Asian American, Black, Latinx, Jewish, Muslim organizations, pretty much standing in solidarity in support of race conscious admissions. But you all are probably very familiar with the media about how it's really been portrayed as an issue that really divides the Asian American community, although the majority of Asian Americans do support affirmative action. But that case, as well as the controversies around the specialized high schools in New York City, has really been a situation where conservative forces have really kind of capitalized on this notion of Asian Americans being at odds with racial justice and educational equity within our educational system, which is, I think, something that we should all take notice of. And it's especially now in this moment of reckoning, where I think it's an opportunity for everyone in the Asian American community to really be unequivocal about supporting, and the topic of this is Asian Black solidarity, but and that's in every sense, right? It's not just in the criminal justice system, it's in every system because it's also interconnected. But that, and to not be complicit in the perpetuation of a very entrenched racial stereotype that Black people, like Black students, Latinx students, for whatever reason, are not deserving of access to kind of elite institutions or certain kinds of educational resources, and really kind of built upon this myth of meritocracy and some sort of objective standard of intelligence or merit or capabilities, and I wanted to talk about this a bit personally because it is personal to me for many reasons. Because, and I'll just use this as an example. I was at a assembly hearing about revising the law about how students get admitted to specialized high schools, and one person, a Korean American witness who represented one of the alumni associations for one of the specialized high schools, was just talking about, very much in support of the test and how important it was, and how the reason why there was such very, very few, Black students who get admitted to schools like Stuyvesant is because, that they're not very good at math, and that if they had more resources to be better at math, then they, so the test was fine. It's just that the students had to, they, for whatever reason, were underperforming in math, and so that's why they weren't doing as well in on the test. And that really struck me because, I, as a Korean American, am not good at math. And, there's a lot of assumptions about me, and I think there's a lot of assumptions about Asian Americans about, and this is very much tied with the model minority myth, about who we are, where we come from, what our challenges have been, what our opportunities were. And that's something that has very much kind of stayed with me even to this day. I think that when someone sees me as an Asian American lawyer in New York City, there's a lot of assumptions about who I am, who my family is, where I come from. And when in fact, I grew up in rural Tennessee. I went to a very under-resourced high school where not only did we not have AP classes, but we, the only electives that I could take were typing and home economics. And not having those educational opportunities, I also, both in college and in law school, had lower than average standardized test scores. And so, this image of the reality of who I am is very much, in conflict with this kind of stereotype of the deserving Asian American student who had these fabulous grades and academic performance, who's deserving of getting into these kind of elite institutions. And that to me really kind of signifies, what is it that we as a community believe in terms of educational equity? Because, and it's absolutely true that, that there is discrimination against Asian Americans. And I think that underlying this is this kind of perpetual sense of invisibility and a lack of recognition of the discrimination that Asian Americans experience. But by aligning ourselves with a kind of a colorblind mentality of some sort of objective measure of worth and of meritocracy, we're really doing ourselves a disservice, because not only are we promoting a worldview, but also a legal framework that will harm us in terms of, you know, fighting against our own experiences of discrimination, whether it's in education or employment or any other context. But it's really buying into the sense that the so-called objective measures are accurately measuring the qualifications and the merit of Black and Latinx students, when we know, you know, just from, I mean, what we know just as fact is that we still live in a very segregated society, and our educational system is incredibly broken, and the students primarily who are suffering from that are Black and Latinx. And so you know, in many ways, I think that by thinking that in our own self-interest, that a colorblind kind of legal system or a way of thinking about the world serves Asian Americans, that kind of thinking, and in fact is very much tied to the perpetuation of the model minority myth, which is very damaging to our community. And it also undervalues the majority of Asian Americans who, you know, may not have the highest test scores or may not have the access to all the resources that and that some people do. And that's not to say that, you know, and I know that this is oftentimes a difficult conversation, because there are so many families that have sacrificed so much and have come to this country with so many dreams and aspirations, especially for their children, and to see that, and perhaps not as informed about the history that Jenna talked about in terms of the connection between, you know, the liberation of Asian Americans with, you know, Black liberation, and then they are very intertwined. But I think that in this moment, where, you know, I have to say, it's incredible that this is a time where race is at the forefront, and so often when people talk about privilege or when we talk about inequities, you know, so many people are afraid to talk about race, and yet now we're living in a time where people almost feel compelled to acknowledge, you know, racism. I think this is a moment where we as a community should also be thinking about how we can help each other to overcome our own kind of biases and our own discrimination. And I would say not even anti-Black racism, but also racism within our own community, and the colorism and the discrimination within, you know, the various ethnicities within the Asian American community. So I think this is a moment for all of us to challenge ourselves to think about what kind of transformative world that we want to live in. And I loved how Jen had described that this is about transformation. It's not about trying to get, you know, the few crumbs that are given to us, but instead kind of working together with other marginalized groups to re-envision what the world is. And I really hope that, you know, with all of this activism and enthusiasm, and I think a real, just from conversations I've had, a real need to do something. I think this is a moment for all of us to kind of challenge ourselves individually, whether it's with our personal relationships, with our elders, with, you know, with our friends in our workplace, to really think about how, you know, we as Asian Americans have perhaps benefited from the discrimination against Black communities, but in a way actually not benefited, but in truth have kind of handcuffed ourselves in terms of furthering our own liberation. And so I just think this is why I just thought it was really wonderful that this put together, and I'm so glad about the kind of attendance, and I really look forward. I hope we have time for the Q&A later. But so thank you so much for letting me be part of this.
Thank you, Jin Hee. Thank you so much. And I think we definitely do want to make time for Q&A. So I think I may cut some of the prepared questions that we had so we can really have conversation, because I know there's a lot of activity in the chat box for questions. And I think John is sort of scanning and collecting them. So for folks who have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But first, I want to turn to Jason, our last panelist. And I think this is actually a really good segue from what Jin Hee was saying to what kind of you've been writing about recently, Jason. You recently wrote an op-ed where you called on Asian Americans to join the Black Lives Matter movement by building cross-racial solidarity and intersectional mass movements. Can you talk a little bit more about intersectionality and kind of sort of what you mean in making this call?
Great, thank you, and thank you for having me. This has been really incredible presentations, and I've learned so much already. So when I talk about intersectionality, I'm referencing Kimberly Crenshaw and also Angela Davis. So I'm using it to talk about both intersectional identities and the ways in which different marginalization overlaps across different categories of identity, but also in thinking about overlapping movements and social movements. And so I think, you know, when we talk about what's happening with Black Lives Matter and the issues around policing and the calls to defund police, we also have to think about the relationship to the Abolish ICE movement and what's happening in immigration detention centers. And so making the connection between prisons and immigration detention, making the connection between decriminalizing sex work and who's impacted in that community, particularly trans women of color and Black and brown trans women, right? And so that's also a movement that's tied to issues around policing. It's also tied to issues around immigration. Thinking about the anti-war movement and thinking about how, you know, historically, if we look at people like MLK and Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party, the opposition to the US war in Vietnam and US imperialism abroad, and how that ties also to the struggles here in the US around racism and challenging white supremacy. And so I think there's, you know, any movement that you look at, there are connections to be made across communities and across borders. And Jen kind of talked about this as well. And I think it's really important to think about how we can link these struggles and make the connections between these issues because they are tied together and our struggles are interconnected. And we are stronger when we're able to make those connections and to build solidarity across identities and communities. I think the current Black Lives Matter movement's demands around challenging police violence and the calls to defund the police does a good job of framing that. And what I mean by that is in these campaigns to defund the police, there's been a use of a framework around invest, divest. So thinking about how we can invest in communities and divest from policing. Because when we think about budgets, these are political documents or moral documents, and they're documents that prioritize what we think the needs of the community are. And for far too long, especially in a place like New York City, we spend billions and billions of dollars a year on the NYPD, and that doesn't even take into account the budget for Department of Corrections and the state monies that go into policing and all the other monies that goes into paying for police misconduct lawsuits, which go into the hundreds of millions of dollars every year. And so I think when we take this invest, divest framework, we're able to then link the struggles against police violence for Black communities to also the struggles around investment in education, which is an issue that, you know, we often hear about in the Asian American community as one of the priority issues. And so how do we actually think about educational equity? Is it just about, you know, Asian American students being able to go to quote unquote the most selective schools? Or is it about fighting for funding so that all of the students who go to public schools are able to access a good quality education? And the majority of students who go to public schools are Black, Latinx, and Asian American. I also think the current framing around invest, divest, and defunding the police is helpful because it goes beyond the individual and interpersonal ways in which we understand racism. And some of the other panelists talked about this earlier. We have to have a systemic analysis. And so if we're able to see that the issues that are impacting Black communities and other communities of color that impact Asian Americans are systemic, then we can go beyond the conversations around us versus them, who's individually harming who in any particular individual interaction. Because we have to understand that it's these systems and the historical context that creates the conditions by which communities of color are pitted against each other, that are rooted in laws and policies around racial segregation, right? It's rooted in economic exploitation and who can access what kind of jobs where. That places Asian American communities into tension with Black communities. So I think we have to approach these issues from a systemic lens, and through a systemic analysis, we can challenge and craft demands that challenge these systems on that level, and gets to what Jin was saying earlier about transformational change. And so I'm talking about building across movements and issues. I'm also talking about centering intersectionally marginalized Asian Americans who can help us build those movements. So when we center Black Asians, because there are people who are Black and Asian, there's a clear link there, right, between across struggles and communities. When we think about policing and surveillance of Muslims in the South Asian community, there's a connection there between the racialization of South Asians and Muslim people, with also the ways in which Black people experience policing. Not to say that they're the same, but there are connections that can be made in the ways in which we understand how policing functions in our society to marginalize and oppress people of color. When we center undocumented immigrants who are Asian American, it can help us make the connections between whether it's workers' rights to what's happening in immigration detention centers, and understanding the ways in which we as a society cage people under the pretext of public safety. When we center poor Asians, we're able to have a more systemic analysis around how our communities are invested in or divested in, and the ways in which we're set up to fight over crumbs. And so there's all these ways in which intersectional movements and communities, when they're centered, can create the possibilities for radical change. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jason. So, we had a very long agenda of prepared questions, and but I'm sort of mindful of the time now, and I think there's some really great questions that are being asked in the chat box. So, sort of with the panelists' permission, I'll use moderator privilege to sort of move right into Q&A. And I'm actually trying to scan and sort of think through how to pose these questions at the same time. So forgive me if it's a little clunky, but going back up to, I think I've seen a few questions along these lines here of, and Marcia sort of about half an hour ago posed this question of how to convey the importance of, Black lives while also sort of simultaneously validating the struggles that Asian immigrants have experienced, and sort of for some communities, amongst in our community, Asian immigrant communities, they, folks may feel sort of scarred from racism they've experienced, and it's hard to sort of build those bridges. So maybe Joanne would love, maybe we'll start with you, but I think Jen, others, welcome your thoughts on this question.
Great. I actually turned on my mic because I didn't want to answer this question. I had this really long. Thank you. So I had this really long conversation with a friend of mine who has been helping us to lead all of the intersectionality work. And one of the things she said to me was, she said, I see it's a person of color, and said, I see all of these, young people on Facebook and social media talking about how do we talk to our elders about racism and their anti-Blackness. And it's about this weird call-out culture, right? And one of the things that I've learned over and over again from her is figure out a way to acknowledge the pain of your own elders, because they've had a lot of trauma with being immigrants, being, like what they've had to sacrifice to build their small businesses or what they sacrificed to get here. And the fact that they've never had the space to unpack a lot of that. For a lot of the Korean Americans, everybody points to what happened in LA, the LA riots. I think the merchants who were involved eventually, understood like the cops never came to support you or to help you at all, or nobody came because they just basically want the system, the power structure basically wanted to see you guys tear each other apart. I think people understood that, but I think for a lot of Asian Americans, especially the small businesses that we work with, we've never had a chance to unpack that. So I think when we say to them, don't be racist, I think they think that we're talking down to them and that we're not acknowledging their own challenges and what they've felt with. And so it's been really important for me to talk to other leaders who are doing this, unpacking all of this, the anti-Blackness work, especially from the Black instructors that we're working with, is, always reminding me, don't talk down, acknowledge that all of your elders have all of this trauma, and they've never been given any kind of platform or to be acknowledged, and they've never sat together to talk about what that looks like. And so, I keep saying our job right now is to create this new lexicon to be able to give people new words to talk about what is happening, right? Because I got a call one night, 11:30 at night. Somebody was completely panicked because they said, a friend of mine, there are stores getting looted. This is the height of the marches, and said the cops are standing right there. They're watching this happen. Nobody's doing anything. Oh my God, oh my God. I said, and I had to pause for a second and ask the question of, so they're separate from the protesters, right? And, the merchant said yes. And I said, so they're separate from, did you have a protest in your neighborhood? And they said yes. And I said, how'd that go? They were fine. So out there, who's out there robbing the jewelry store? They're looters, and they're very different than the protesters. Do you understand? They said yes. So I think even in that conversation to calm people down is to say, you can't, the protesters are not the ones looting your store, looting a friend's store, right? It is to teach them, what is happening in the community and developing new vocabulary, because at that point, I think a little light went off and in his head and said, now I understand what you're trying to say, right? And so I think I just want to acknowledge that I know there is going to be work that I have to, we have to do. And, all the work that we're doing with small businesses, it's going to be hard. And I know there's going to be massive pushback. One of the from them, because I can't go to them and say I know what I'm talking about. Oh my God, stop being racist, right? I need to go and say, what are the challenges that you're seeing, right? I need to acknowledge what they've experienced and their Asian American experience and what they've had to sacrifice to be able to be where they are. And so one of the things that I've been talking to different experts and throwing this idea around has been really about how do I bring different small business leaders of color, because I think they have a lot more in common than they think, right? Nobody's ever convened them so that they actually don't know, by the way, all of your, the MWBE numbers, that you can contract with the city, all of your numbers suck, right? The fact that none of you guys get a chance at the bat, to work with the city and get money. Did you know that? I think presenting information in a very natural setting that's natural for them is always going to be the priority, but that is something that, I'm learning from the people that I'm working with, about how to talk to our elders and how to talk to our, our parents, because I think it's really, and I really appreciate being reminded that, the thing here not to do is to shame people, right? To say, you feeling this way is racist, or like that's anti-blackness, because I don't think our parents understand what that means, right? And so, I'm very mindful of how I want to present information and how I want to be able to build solidarity, build relationships that move beyond this point, so that way they understand that they have a shared and a vested interest in working together.
I really, if I could just jump in, thank you, Joanne, because as you were talking, it just occurred to me something that I want to share with this group. And I don't know a lot of you, so, forgive me, but I sort of just want to share, I want to tell you two stories about my family, right? And both are true. The first story is the story that I was sort of told as a child. Essentially, my parents' life began when they appeared on the coast of the United States, right? They arrived, they did what they could to survive, to get educated, to give my brother and I our best education. They have not thrived in some cases, they have thrived in other cases, and life is suffering, right? And but there's another story about my family that has never been told to me, and that was really only told to me and pieced together as an adult. And that's that my parents themselves are essentially refugees. I don't know many Chinese people who call themselves refugees. But my father was essentially separated from his mother when he was about 10, never saw her until he was 40, smuggled in a box, into the care of another family member. My mother also separated, lived separately across their families, and then kind of came to the United States. They don't think of themselves as war-based refugees, and they certainly don't think of themselves as refugees of wars that were caused by the United States and United States imperialism, even though you could academically come to a conversation with them where that would be acknowledged. And so much of the reason why I want to share those two stories is because exactly what Joanne says, is that the vocabulary in talking to our elders and talking to our peers who are not lawyers or academics or activists is about the vocabulary of shared experiences. But it doesn't mean that we demean and don't talk about systems, or that we so simplify and that we're not acknowledging a compass of progress and rights in our society. And so, for example, within the past year, my mother said to me, I'm very uncomfortable with everything that's happening. Everything in the US seems very unstable now. And I see on the news the children in cages. That feels too far for me, like something's wrong. And I use that conversation to say, my parents, who are lifelong Republicans, well, is that system that allows us to cage children perhaps the same system that caused trouble in your life, perhaps the same system that we see in X, Y, and Z and other injustices? And I think for my parents, at least, connecting those dots in this particularly virulent and violent time has been very important in awakening for them. That their hardcore belief that the United States was on a ladder of progress, and that even if the ladder did not work out for them, that it would work out for my brother and I, was enough and sufficient to believe in an American dream. But to see that being dismantled very publicly and viciously, I think presents a real ripe opportunity for us to organize with our elders and not necessarily against.
Thanks so much, Jen. Jason, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that there is room for us to have conversations with our elders, with our parents, and allow them to express and process the trauma and pain and hurt that they have experienced here in this country. And sometimes that is those are traumas that are experienced through exchanges between communities of color. And that is a reality, right? And that hurt goes both ways. But I think that the issue with oftentimes how that gets deployed is it's used to delegitimize demands and movements for racial justice for Black people. So when we're talking about inequality and systemic racism against Black people and the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and redlining and ongoing discrimination and all of that, you know, sometimes there are people who will resort to pathologizing Blackness and Black communities, right? That, oh, well, they're just not doing what we did, as opposed to having a systemic analysis around how these systems have created the conditions that we now see. And so I don't want to be overly academic about it, but I think there's space to talk about the interpersonal harms that we've experienced for Asian Americans, but also for Black communities at the hands of each other. But I think that that's a conversation that doesn't need to be had in a way that detracts from the current Black Lives Matter movement, right? We can do both. We can talk about interpersonal harm and we can talk about systemic violence. And so I think part of what we need to do is reframe the conversation because we've been conditioned, all of us, we've all been conditioned and socialized to have conversations about race in a particular way. So the conversation around looting is always about Black and Brown communities, quote unquote, looting and committing quote unquote crime. We don't have a conversation about looting in the context of land theft and anti-indigeneity. We don't have a conversation about looting in the context of objectifying Black people as property and stealing people, right, from another continent. We don't have conversations about how $6 billion a year is allocated to the NYPD, and that is looting from Black and Brown communities and Asian American communities and immigrant communities when we underfund and underinvest in healthcare and housing. You know, we have organizations like CAB that's organizing low-income Asian tenants in NYCHA, right? We don't talk about the underinvestment in public housing as an Asian American issue. But that is also a form of looting. And so I think we need to reframe how we're having some of these conversations. So yes, there is interpersonal harm and violence that we need to process, but also there is systemic violence and racism that is perpetuated and pits communities against each other in ways that are destructive for all of us.
Thanks, Jason. So I want to sort of move on to some additional questions. I think there's a question posed about kind of going along one of the themes that was articulated earlier about complicity, and especially I think in the legal community and in a legal system that is you know, characterized by white supremacy in many respects. And so it turns out all of you have legal training. I didn't realize that about Joanne, having gone to law school. So we have practicing and non-practicing lawyers on our panel. So, you know, I think thoughts about how to address kind of white supremacy and our complicity in that as lawyers in our everyday practices. You know, I don't have the question in front of me, but I think that's the gist of what was raised.
So I'll go first because I think that question touches upon, I think, a lot of my frustrations and perhaps the frustrations of many lawyers about the ability to achieve transformation through the legal system, and it's because the law, I think, has historically been very slow and conservative, not conservative in a political sense, conservative meaning incremental, like in a glacial space, in terms of trying to achieve justice and, you know, equality and all the things that that you would aspire to when you think about being a lawyer, and yet you actually practice law and you realize all the barriers and obstacles that are in your way. But in my mind, at a very fundamental level, and this is, and you know, and some of this is also because I you know, do racial justice work legally, so as a racial justice lawyer, is this notion, and it's a very powerful kind of narrative of equality, meaning race blindness or color blindness, that somehow if you consider race, that is in itself a form of discrimination. and that in order to be equal, in order for the world to be equal and for the law to be equal, you just should erase race, like just don't think about race. And I think that both in terms of, you know, Asian Americans' complicity in that, and that most obvious example is affirmative action or any kind of race consciousness, right? And the idea that, you know, race consciousness in education means that the world isn't equal, that by erasing race, you're ignoring the pre-existing racial inequities that we all live with. It's in many ways, it's kind of a fairy tale. And it perpetuates and really entrenches the very, you know, inequities that we're trying to dismantle through, you know, kind of through the law. And so that to me is, you know, something that I really hope that you know, the current events and the kind of the focus on race. I mean, it is somewhat remarkable that people are talking about race right now, because it's for so long, you know, to even mention the word race was uncomfortable, and you wanted to talk about everything else besides race. And, you know, to even bring up the legacy of slavery, you know, some people would like roll their eyes, like, why are we talking about that again? This isn't distant history. But I think that, you know, what I would hope is to bring race back to the central focus of what lawyers should be doing, is acknowledging that there is so much entrenched discrimination for all different groups, but absolutely for Black people in this country, given the history that they've had to face with, and how that has had a trickle effect on so many other people of color in this country. And as lawyers, to think about, to not think about the law in an abstract way, as if the law is this kind of neutral arbiter of justice, as opposed to a product of the very racism that was kind of embedded into our initial, you know, our Constitution when it was created, and our country, and that we've had to try to overcome over the many generations. And kind of being constantly cognizant of the fact that what appears to be neutral or abstract is in fact not abstract at all. That race has made its imprint on everything within the law. And then I would also say that this is so important is, and again, this is kind of my theme of like all of us challenging ourselves, is just the legal community challenging itself, because it has so much work to do when it comes to even racial diversity and opportunities and advancement within the legal community, and certainly for Asian Americans as well as other groups. But you know, just because even if you do racial justice work, that doesn't give you a free pass in terms of your own interactions with the people in your office, the way that you do your recruitment and hiring, the way that you do your promotions, the way that you interact with your clients, the way that you think about the communities that you're working with, and certainly for any other kind of practice in law, to be constantly cognizant of how race and power dynamics play out in terms of people's opportunities, and who speaks and who's the spokesperson, and who, you know, whose ideas get listened to, whose ideas, you know, all of those things I think are really important, and of course the intersectionalities of that too. But those are some of the things that I like as a legal community, that I hope that we would really kind of take this moment to try to, you know, challenge ourselves as well.
If I can
Jason, I know you had some thoughts here. Yeah.
Yeah. So I really appreciate Jin's remarks on this point. I think, you know, there is a challenge as a lawyer trying to work in social movements, because part of the work that we do is inherently limiting. The courts are not going to save us. The revolution will not be at the Supreme Court or state court or any court, right? But the work that we do is still important. And so I often think of what we do similar to voting. It's a form of harm reduction. And so it's important, and it does have a meaningful impact on people's lives. But at the same time, I think as lawyers who oftentimes are given a public platform because of the social status that we have in society, it's also important that we're not constantly saying no, right? We're not constantly saying, we can't defund police, or we can't abolish ICE, or that we can't transform the systems that need to be transformed. I think it's important for us to be self-critical of our role and the voice that we have. And so we can do both things. We can both engage in harm reduction through whether it's litigation or legislative work, and we can also support social movements that are demanding and organizing for a better world. And so I think we need to be able to do both. And I think that tension is, we see that right now regarding the Black Lives Matter demand around what does defund the police mean? Is it just budget cuts, or are we talking about reimagining public safety? Because there is a difference between public safety versus security. Prisons represent security, but they're not safe places. We know that prisons are a violent place. And so how do we reimagine public safety in a way that isn't just about policing, but that is about safe housing, that is about access to healthcare so that people can take care of themselves during this pandemic and beyond. And so I think there are questions around how we can support broader social movements and these larger demands for transformation while also doing the work that we do as lawyers.
Thanks, Jason. I'm just looking at the time, it's 7:15, and there's some really great information and questions in the chat box. John, thank you so much for volunteering to compile the resources. So I think folks can contact John if they'd like sort of a list of the resources that have been shared through the chat. There have been a number of other questions posed, and forgive me if I've overlooked your questions. I'm sort of scrambling on the side here to track them. But maybe in light of the time, I'll just sort of share out some of the questions that have been put in the chat, and then folks on the panel, please kind of respond to what seems right to respond for you. So a couple of questions. I think there are a few about kind of like, well, okay, what can we do, right? Like how can we get organized? What sort of organized actions can we take? Individual practice is great, but what else? There was a question about whether there are efforts or groups that are promoting more socialization among groups. And so if anybody has any awareness of that, I think that would be great to hear about. And then similarly, it seems like there's interest in sort of learning more about creation of the Asian American identity and how that came out of the Black Power movement. And so any sort of resources that you can share, maybe that's something that we can put in the chat, but that was something else that came up. So maybe I'll start with that round. Folks, please feel free to weigh in and share your thoughts on those questions.
I guess I can answer a little bit of a little glimmer that I saw. Because we do work with a lot of small businesses and small business associations during the height of COVID, before the protests and before Mr. Floyd's murder. Some of the folks that we work, small business associations work with, have a lot of these safety masks, right? And so they were trying to figure out who they wanted to give them to. And they were very thoughtful and said, we see what is happening in the news and we know who is dying. And so it's natural for us to want to give all of these masks to all of the Asian nonprofits, right? But we also want to make sure that the community that suffered the most gets them too. So, we had to, my staff had to scramble to figure out like who's the best to get this mask, who is open to accept the masks, right? Thousands and thousands. I think now it's just like, we probably distributed at least, maybe 25,000 masks. But, I think that goes back to saying like, because of what is happening, our elders and ourselves, like people are seeing what is happening and they're understanding. And in every way, they are trying to engage in their own way. And I think, I feel like that's a really, and for us, it's like at the Federation, we try to reinforce all those things, right? Like to say, oh my God, this is so great. It's appreciative. We pass on thank you things, because I think it's really hard for people to understand all of these conversations. I think it's hard, but I think they do understand. And they said, oh my God, like our Black customers are dying because they don't have anything simple like these face masks. So how about if we just send them 10,000 masks, right? And who's the best to organize that? So I do see where people are starting to understand and they're engaging. And so I feel like, how do we use these little moments where people really see humanity and they see each other? How do we use that to be able to build connections?
And then just to respond to sort of one of the questions, I want to bring us back to sort of the opening question, which was, so what is the practice of solidarity? And I want us to be careful as a group to not accept that inclusivity or partnership is in itself an act of solidarity, that is just the work that has to be done on the path for us to become stronger, practicing anti-racists. But that the actual work of solidarity is centering the leadership of others over our own, right? What does it mean for us to acknowledge and center the leadership of Black Lives Matter's activists, of Black communities, to determine what the carceral system should look like as the community that is most proximate to the daily violence inflicted by the system? Such in the same way that we would not expect other people to weigh in. I would not expect other people to weigh in on U.S.-China relations, right? I would expect that the Chinese community will take the lead, right? The definition of solidarity around it is so difficult, I think, to get our heads around, because it means removing ourselves out of the gatekeeper and the role of control. And that is something that lawyers in particular, we have infinite difficulty doing, because we were trained to be successful gatekeepers, to be knowers of the facts, of the knowledge, of the strategy, and of the implementation. But in fact, I think for us to be effective supporters in times of movements for significant social change, we have to upend that and remember that that strategy is what we learned in law school as the most effective strategy to enforce the regulations and the legal systems, which again, are the systems that culturally are the strongest proponents and enforcements of white supremacy. So it's like how do we actually remove all those layers of the onion? And practicing humanity and interaction and understanding and socialization is part of that journey. And if that's something that folks are thinking about, then I say, seek out those opportunities. One of the best things about living online is that those opportunities are rife wherever you are now. At North Star Fund, we're a multiracial cross-class organization. We operate an annual program called the Giving Project. I urge you to take a look at it. It's where we train people to become grassroots fundraisers and to think about how to center organizing and grassroots leadership from communities most proximate to injustice. But we do it in the lens of teaching people the shared history of racialized capitalism, and in particular, our lived experiences. And nowadays, there are so many programs, whether it's PSAB, Undoing Racism, there are many spaces that you can seek out either professionally through your organization or on your own to learn about the history, learn about the movements from which our identities come, and then begin to practice it in allyship with folks who have also gone through those processes.
Thanks, Jen. Jin Hee, Jason, any final thoughts from you?
I can go first. So I want to go back to Angela Davis, who I think most people know who she is, but she's a scholar, activist, prison abolitionist, former political prisoner, and just amazing, incredible person who I take a lot of guidance from in terms of my politics. And she wrote a fabulous book, which is actually a collection of essays and transcribed interviews called Freedom is a Constant Struggle. And so I highly recommend reading that. And this one conversation is not going to be able to capture many of the ideas that we've referenced, but there's so much literature out there and resources for people to self-educate. And it goes beyond just learning, right? We need to do something with the information that we learn, but it is an important starting point. And so she talks about this idea of freedom as a constant struggle. And Jennifer mentioned earlier that solidarity is a practice. And I want us to think about what does it look like to commit and recommit to the struggle against white supremacy in this country. And so what does that look like when the news cycle changes? And we already see that the news cycle has started to change, as we saw, back in 2013 and every year, right, when there's a new face of the Black Lives Matter struggle. And so we need to recommit. And the last thing I'll say, I want to just read a little bit from a quick quote from Mari Matsuda in her piece called "We Will Not Be Used." She says, "If white historically is the top of the racial hierarchy in America, and Black historically is the bottom, will yellow assume the place of the racial middle? The role of the racial middle is a critical one. It can reinforce white supremacy if the middle deludes itself into thinking it can be just like white if it tries hard enough. Conversely, the middle can dismantle white supremacy if it refuses to be the middle, if it refuses to buy into racial hierarchy, if it refuses to abandon communities of Black and brown people, choosing instead to form alliances with them." And so she's another person that I take a lot of guidance from in terms of her teachings. And what we do is a choice. And I want to leave us with that it is a choice, and we can choose solidarity, or we can choose complicity, or we can choose racism, and we can rationalize and justify, and we can make excuses for it. We can do all of those things, but we can also choose solidarity. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Jin Hee, any final thoughts from you?
It's really hard to follow Mari Matsuda's words.
Yes.
So that was, it kind of set me up a little bit. So, but I think that there's things that we can do on different fronts, obviously politically, and, Jen had just some great ideas about just supporting her work. And so I think that there's just a lot of opportunities right now to kind of support Black Lives Matter and amazing organizations and amazing grassroots organizers. And I think that's so important. But I also think that we have to do work personally in our personal relationships. And one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is how it's, and part of this is what I think what others had said about, especially in this moment, that we really need to put in central focus the experience of Black people. I think there's a time for reflection later, but in this moment, kind of not kind of, letting go of kind of our own egos, and really kind of listening and putting at the forefront the very specific kind of suffering that Black people have had in this country, since it was created, since slavery, and but also I think a part of that is obviously listening, but also doing things that are uncomfortable for us, and that may mean kind of having difficult conversations with people. It may mean kind of thinking very much like scrutinizing our, kind of our own kind of selves and our own relationships, and trying to do better. So that's something that I think that I know that I'm personally trying to do, both professionally, kind of trying to support things that are happening in the community, but also at a personal level, like really thinking hard about, even with my best intentions, is there more that I can do, or things that, that maybe I've been kind of too comfortable with, and that I need to kind of do more to get to that place of discomfort, because that's where I think the real work is, and that's where the real kind of change happens.
Thank you, Jin Hee. I think I feel like that's really been a theme for this evening, right? Of sort of thinking about anti-racism and solidarity as a practice, and being comfortable with discomfort. So it's almost 7:30, and I really want to thank our panelists for this conversation, and for folks who've joined for the really great questions and comments and suggestions and resources that have been shared in the chat. I am going to kind of turn it back over to John to close us out for this evening. But I hope this will be the first of many conversations, and thank the panelists so much for guiding us here.